So on the panel, we have Anastasia again, and we have Suji, and we have Marcus, and we have Nicole from Zuzalu. All of them represent different kind of a decentralized community, and then they leverage the power of decentralized community to actually start making impact in the world. So now we can ask them, how do they actually govern their huge decentralized community, and how can we allow and learn from them, as we also have a huge number of digital residents. I will leave the microphone to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello again. And it's great that we will now have a chance to dive a bit deeper into questions we will bring to us of these wonderful people, who I will introduce or reintroduce first because we've spoken for all of them. But just as a little reminder, we have Marcus Aurelius from KlimaDAO, we have Suji from Fast Network, and we have Nicole from Zuzalu. So before we dive in, I just wanted to note how amazing this moment is, where we have three instances of very different communities, where governance is actually in full bloom in terms of how experimental we have to be. We're actually forging a new way in so many areas, just to see what experiments we could have, and it's fun. And so I would like to ask a few questions of you guys, but then of course open it up to the public so we can investigate together about what the potential of governance is. And where to state, even though we work with governments that are more traditional, we work a lot with communities that are emerging. And this work, I must admit, is way more exciting because here we can really play and experiment more boldly. So I would like to start with you, Nicole. And I would like to invite you to share a story of how Zuzalu came about. And were you thinking in terms of governance back then, or you just wanted to bring the people you like and enjoy being with, and then it turned out to be something that could be a new governance back in the world? Yes. Okay.
You skip the red light. It looks like they're good.
So how Zuzalu got started? It was initially, I was at breakfast with DevCon, with Vitalik at DevCon. This is last November. And we were talking about the hacker houses I used to throw. So I met him at a hacker house and started inviting him to the hacker houses I used to throw. And he would come quite regularly. So in Korea, he visited, and we met at DevCon. And I think our takeaway was that these hacker houses are really magical. Like you have 20, 30 people, they're all hacking, but you really get to know each other and you really become friends, co-living together and co-working. And we were like, okay, how do we scale this up in a way that's functional? And so we slowly came to an idea of Zuzalu. I think he's been tinkering with the idea of digital patch for a very long time. But Zuzalu was the first time we actually wanted to try this out in person. What does this look like? How can you bring together a large number of people for a longer period of time? So we settled on 200 people. So it's like a little over Dunbar's number, but enough that you get different fields all incorporated and well represented for 2 months, which is a bit longer than your typical conference. And it was a really quick slur when we first came to the event. So us actually hosting it again, there was only 2 months. So we pulled together the whole event in 2 months. We chose our venue in Montenegro. Really in like a short period of time, we just determined that we had everything we needed and we just ran with it. So yeah, we started our event in March, started planning officially in January. At first we were like, okay, let's just meet some new people. Let's invite one person from each field to help us invite people in that field. And that way we got to meet a lot more new people and it wasn't biased to our existing network. And then we realized that, okay, we're going to need some form of governance here. It's just like a needs-based thing. At first we were just a small core team of 4. But then we were like, we cannot be making decisions forever that comes, right? So we ended up having town halls every single week at Zuzalu. So every Tuesday, we bring together everyone, we sit together. There'd be a short agenda that the core team wanted to run through. And then we just open it up to everyone to give us a lot of feedback on like, hey, like this is what we should be experimenting with. Hey, I'd like to say here. So I think our governance was very much rudimentary. We didn't start with something in mind. It was ground up of what people needed. And I thought that worked out pretty well. Like, for example, all of our core team members are like globally distributed, but we were lacking a representative from Africa. One of our core members, Janine, is from South Africa, but she doesn't live there now. So we actually talked to more of the Afropolitan team. So they're like a network state based out of Africa. And they were like, hey, like if we had someone on the core team, we would have done this a bit differently. So through meeting more people in our community, we ended up realizing that there's a big need for governance. And now we're still settling on like, what are we going to run with? We don't have like a governance token. We don't want to ever release a token, but we do need a way of like taking into account everyone's opinions. So we still run these town halls every week online, virtually. And that's been what we've found works best, like just getting feedback from the people directly, not having like layers of obfuscation of how things work. So yeah, that's how we do things currently.
Okay. And do you recognize, Nicole, your potential role in creating governance in these spaces? I know it hasn't started with that intention in mind, but now that you are who you are where you are, you know, these things will probably get replicated and multiplied. Do you want to use this space to actually throw out some blueprints for others to follow, just because you can?
Right now,
Not necessarily DAO, but just anything that just come up with something new in governance sense.
we had like some very interesting people who had proposed like different ideas. Like I don't know if I'm confident to come up with like a new governance model right now, but I thought it was very interesting that we were more like populist in nature, and we got a lot of different results once we started being more ZK. So we were privacy preserving in everything we did, from polling to getting feedback, etc. I think that was kind of a new thing that we experimented with, is letting people give their opinions completely anonymous, and also experimenting with how we took in feedback. So some people did really well in the town hall setting of like speaking up, but that was usually dominated by like a small subset of more extroverted people. So then we had to try like different methods of meeting people and getting their feedback on governance. So we had like CK polling online, that's best for introverts. And we also had like small meetings where we would grab 10 random people, and we would do this weekly, with each person now being requested to host the next one. So we would be the first ones to start off this chain of like, hey, like what do you want out of Zuzalu? How do you think we should run Zuzalu? But then the people that are part of this first one would host that workshop. And that kind of worked out so that people like me aren't in charge of doing the governance. We just source ideas from everyone in the community. And yeah, like people chose different ways of how they hosted their weekly panel of 10 people. Like some people brought people to their houses, cooked together, and asked them for feedback. Some people did more formal or virtual stuff. So yeah, I think I want to decentralize myself and not be the person that's responsible for coming up with these new models, but handing it off to different people and experimenting.
Yeah, sure. No, I didn't mean you personally, even though that could be an interesting one. But I mean, are there efforts to actually solicit and crowdsource these ideas? Because I think, you know, many ideas are looking for a space to get implemented. From that perspective, I thought maybe you want to open yourself up to some. I'm sure this will be going on later. But thank you so much. And Suji, I'd like to ask you, since, you know, network states was something that was discussed in Zuzalu and being discussed around the world right now, what is your take on the various recipes of governance for the network states? Because even in Zuzalu, we saw, let me say, two schools of thoughts. That was classical Balajian network state, that is, you know, around a particular issue with some physical land or not. So it was like a very particular model. But then there was another approach that emerged that's called coordinations, where this was more around broader societal vision. It was an emergence of several projects coming together, so it's more collaborative in nature. And the idea was that network states should not be defined by just Balajian vision, but, you know, there's so many other recipes for success. How do you see the future of network states in terms of different ways in which it could be governed?
Yeah, I mean, like the technology is new, like that we have in blockchain or Web3 is new, but I think the people in the industry have, you know, lack a little bit about understanding the past, the history, right? This is not new. I mean, evolving a new country is not new. I mean, it's new in our lifetime, because in our lifetime, there's probably not really a lot of countries get independence, but it's not really new in this century. And, you know, this example of Singapore is only 70 years old, and it get kicked out by other countries. Okay, it's not really saying they want really 100% independence, they kick out. There's in the past few hundred years, and even in the past 300 years, the form of independent countries and the development of industrialization and capitalism are together. So I think what I learned from the process and after interacting with many people is like I think we need to take a serious look into the history, take a serious look into historical examples. Like for example, the question, the discussion in Zuzalu and many other places about whether we need a physical place, whether we need like Pilates version or not. I think if you look into history, won't ask this question because like the original idea of independent cyberspace from 1996, the EFS version, and then they quote a lot of the founding fathers' language, the American founding father language, and then you look back into the founding father language, and they actually want something not really just lands, they want something they can control their tax. Right, I think that's the fundamental. Like when we doing a transaction on chain, we actually paying the tax through the gas fee to the governments we recognize. So that's why some institutional users don't want to use Trump because they don't want to contribute to, right? I think that's the fundamental thing. Compared to the land, you should ask questions about tax, about who is running the lands, right? I think by looking into the history, we've been able to find very interesting historical comparison. We're going to find those masterpieces, those great minds. They ask a question in the past, even though the situation is very different, the technology is very different, but people is always the same. That's something I learned. I think I was always using those historical examples. I think they're going to guide us really to the network state, to what kind of lifestyle or kind of like independent state that's going to come in. Yeah. That's my perspective.
And talking about historical examples, to what extent do you think, we who like to think about or even apply the network states ideas, to what extent we have to try and work with legacy systems and, for example, Montevideo Convention of 1937, I believe, defines what it means to be a country or a nation. I would argue hugely outdated because it requires you to have a language, it requires you to have shared language, it requires you to have all these things that sort of matter less these days. Now, what you would do with it was 100 years ago when it was coined, it was never revisited. Do you think will we need to interact with those, try to change them, or we just create a parallel system and see what is more appealing?
I think we need all these. And again, I can answer your questions through historical comparison. I mean, like, for example, Palau is very new. Montenegro is also very new, like 20, 30 years old. There's many countries, they're still a little bit older, but it's actually quite new, 70 years old, Singapore. Answer your question, like, the American founding fathers, among them, there's one interesting guy, Benjamin Franklin. And I think he loved Paris more than Philadelphia. He loved like London more than Philadelphia. And it's like in his our lifetime, he his early days and until he's like 50, 60, he recognized himself as a citizen of the great British Empire. And then he realized, okay, the fucking king is trying to tax us. I don't like the tax. So he went to France and he went to London for 10 years. He went to France, Paris for the rest of his life, right? And he's not refusing to talk to the royal family of France. So that, that's really similar concept of the Hong Kong blockchain thing. There's a lot of people from Chinese, right? A lot of people ask me, hey, Suji, what do you think about the Hong Kong blockchain thing, right? I told them, like Benjamin Franklin's largest, like one of his greatest achievement is he's realistic enough to went to Paris and to meet the royal family. That time, the largest dictator, the King Louis, and then you tell the King Louis, I know you don't care about the independence, whatever, but you care about the ass of the British. So give us money and gun. And you bring it back to help to lead to win the victory of independence. I think that's important. So that's my opinion. When people ask me about Hong Kong blockchain, whatever, I was thinking about Benjamin Franklin Paris, right? And when people ask me about the conversation between the traditional governments and modern DAOs, I was thinking like when in the early days of Benjamin Franklin, he still believed he's like a loyal member of the royal family to the royal family of the British Kingdom. So yeah, people are going to change. It's going to be a transitional process. In our lifetime, our view is going to change. But just as the transition goes inside us, the transition goes across the world as well. So yeah, I think that's going to be a great answer.
Thank you. Interesting times, are they not? Really exciting. Marcus, could you also share, because you guys, and thank you for the wonderful presentation, you are effectively building a new blueprint for governance beyond doubt. Could you talk to us about the transparency and inclusivity aspects of what you do, and to what extent, you want this to become new emerging practice, and maybe you could give some specific examples of how you do it?
Yeah, so the traditional carbon markets rely a lot on word of mouth and talking to each other over the phone. So at a certain level, out of the box, just by running on chain, we get a lot of those benefits of public transaction records, permissionless access that on the traditional rails just aren't readily available. In terms of specific examples where the greater transparency and inclusivity, I think, demonstrates its power. I mentioned in my talk about the need for methodologies to evolve over time. And there have been some examples of methodologies that have fallen out of favor for one reason or another. And there's a particular methodology to do with the production of refrigerant gases, which have a very strong, there's a byproduct of the production of refrigerant gases that have a very strong warming effect, greenhouse gas effect. And there was a methodology developed way back in the 90s in the first generation of carbon markets, which would pay factories to install a piece of equipment that would destroy this byproduct and therefore reduce the greenhouse gas associated with it, greenhouse gas effect associated with it. And over time, some issues were identified with the methodology. Particular projects were gaming the system, taking advantage of the methodology the way it was originally written. And the carbon markets never really figured out a way to cleanly move on from this methodology. So, at a certain point in 2014, the major registry said that no new projects would be able to issue under this existing methodology. It's called HFC 23. The byproducts all just refer to it as the HFC 23 methodology. And so these credits were sitting out there for a decade, being used to some extent to make claims, but sort of sitting idle on the books. And there wasn't a mechanism under the traditional registry structure to destroy these credits and help the market move on. Instead, they would just sit out there. And it was sort of a constant concern of, is another media piece going to come out about this methodology? And so some of these credits made their way on chain during KlimaDAO's launch. And as we began to understand the problem, I conducted some data analysis and figured out that these particular credits were no longer being used. Back in 2014, the methodology had been deprecated, but the credits were never destroyed. And so using our public governance process, we actually we posted a proposal. We went through the process of diligencing and voting on the proposal, and then we destroyed about 700,000 tons of this HFC 23 methodology credits. And so now those credits are destroyed once and for all. We can cleanly move on. And I think this is a really important mechanism that the broader carbon markets need to develop for how we deal with methodologies that once were thought to be effective and doing good. Because I want to be clear, destroying HFC 23 is a really important thing to be doing at the time. It's just that things changed and that methodology was no longer appropriate. And I think that decentralized governance, through greater inclusiveness and transparency of what's going on, has the potential to address the need for methodologies to evolve over time.
Thank you. And since you are operating in such a fast evolving space, how do you keep up with that change, with that pace of change? How do you learn? How do you make sure that you remain, on top of the game when it comes to ever-changing governance processes?
Yeah, it's not easy. One of the things that we have the advantage of is that we have a community of tens of thousands of people all over the world, and they're tapped into what's going on. So we have some channels in our Discord chat server where people are raising latest developments in the carbon markets, discussing the implications. And if there is a need to take action, the governance process is permissionless, right? Anybody can go and post a proposal and say, hey, I think this methodology isn't appropriate anymore. We should do something about it. Or, hey, I heard about this new project. We should integrate with them. So basically, by casting a wide net and having a lot of different stakeholders involved in the process, we're much better positioned to keep up with the changing landscape than, say, a centrally controlled top-down corporation where any change needs to be approved by the CEO or the board. That really slows things down and leads to a sort of tunnel vision, focus on what are we doing today and how can we do it how can we do that more instead of being open to new possibilities?
Thank you so much. Now, let me ask one question to all three of you, because I'm very curious to hear your answer to that, and then we can probably open it to questions from the audience. I want to ask you, a very simple, straightforward question. What does future of governance look like to you?
Here is, I don't know. I think it's going to be very, very, like, we'll have different schools of thought, and there's going to be a lot more research done into each different type. So, like, as you pointed out, like Primavera's coordination is vastly different from Balaji's network state. I think we'll see more of these new ideas come about and more in-depth discussion of like what works best. And we'll see like in real life experiments that verify like what seems to work, what doesn't seem to work. So my answer is we'll see, because
A particular vision, what would you like for it to be?
I don't think I speak for any of the existing ones. I don't think any of them are perfect yet. Yeah, so I think we're still far from seeing something that's like fully functional. But in our experiments, we'll see. I think we'll actually like get to live through this entire process in this part of history.
I think the message is going to be different, but it goes to stand like the quote from Lincoln: "The government of people, by the people, for people, should never perish from the earth." Yeah.
The way I'm thinking about the future of governance is that right now we have some very strong defaults. So for instance, if you're governing a country, the default is one person, one vote. If you're governing a DAO, for a long time, the default has been one token, one vote. And now we're seeing the emergence of things that fit in between on that spectrum. For instance, Gitcoin uses quadratic voting and quadratic funding, which strikes a balance between giving everyone equal power and giving people with more financial capital a greater voice. We also see approaches like Optimism's bicameral governance process, where some decisions are made through a one person, one vote decision-making process, and other decisions are made through a one token, one vote. So I really think the future of governance is that the governance mechanism for a given project will be tailored and made appropriate for the particular scope of problem that that governance system is trying to solve. And if you're governing a nation, maybe a democratic system, one person, one vote is more appropriate. If you're governing a financial system, then you need to have some way of representing the fact that people with more financial capital have more of a stake in the future of that system than people with less. So I think it's really going to be about learning the lessons from how governance has worked in the past and tailoring each governance system to the particular community and problem set that that governance system is trying to solve.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I think it would be a good time to take questions from the audience.
Thank you everyone for wonderful sharing. And I actually had a question for Nicole. So you mentioned that like Zuzalu actually invites one person from each domain. Although they may come from different backgrounds, but they share similar interests and also mindsets because they're willing to share and willing to contribute together. But I was wondering, like, have you considered that we need to break the echo chamber one day? Because, like, after all, if we want everyone to adopt crypto technology one day for everyone in the world, there are like 7 billion people out there. We need to break the echo chamber outside the box, like, because I used to work in media kind of industry. I know how hard it is to break this echo chamber, because people within the echo chamber, it would reinforce each other's concepts, but people are wired differently. So I want to hear about your idea. Thank you.
You mean like crypto as the echo chamber, right?
Kind of, yes.
Yeah. So I guess for Zuzalu this time around, we weren't just crypto only. So crypto was one of the big focuses, but another was longevity and broadly decentralized science. So like we had our entire first week was ran by this entire thing called like the SynBio Beta team. So they did synthetic biology and they brought in like, wonderful professors like Jurangi, and they have zero understanding of crypto. Like they were there for the synthetic bio and it was awesome. And I think you're completely correct. And we should have done more of that, because that week, like even Vitalik, we were learning new things for the first time. It completely broke the mold of like a typical crypto conference, which only has like everyone geeking out about like ZK tech. This time we like thought about cells for the first time in a very long time. So I think we should do more of that, and that's like a direction we're moving more for Zuzalu. is actually having new tracks every single time. So this time around, we focused on like a certain subset of tracks, but I think we'll crowdsource like more opinions of like, hey, what else is a frontier technology that should have more light shed on it? And I think you bring up a good point of media. We had like terrible media coverage of Zuzalu, and it was pretty much intentional. But that also meant that everyone had like a misunderstanding of what we did. So like certain people who subscribed to longevity newsletters thought we were like very rich people living there doing like crazy life experiments. So yes, I think we need better coverage of what we do as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. So my question is actually an AI-based one. One of the presuppositions of a lot of these governance models, which I think has been good for a long time, is that if we can get the crowd, the larger the crowd, sort of the better ideas that will come in over time. And I see the look on your face, so you probably know the exact way that I'm going. There was just a study that I read, I believe, a week and a half ago, and I think that it was a team working on BARD that they had a bunch of Google engineers and they showed them two different answers. One was right and one was wrong that BARD had presented. And 40% of the time, people who were experts in that field picked the wrong answer. That this AI was able to actually write out a very long answer and convince experts in the field that the wrong answer was the right answer. And those are experts in the field. Often when we're dealing with DAOs and other things where we're involving the public, these aren't experts. And a lot of people, it's their subjective opinion. I just wanted to get you guys' thoughts. I know that this, maybe 5 years ago, this wouldn't have been as big of an exploit, but with as cheap as AI is and the capability that this could be happening in a community where there's an important vote and somebody is able to actually start to insert this type of thing. I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on how you think this can be mitigated moving forward.
I think in the very end, like maybe in 100 years, we can give AI human rights. That's kind of an inevitable process. Like, because if you have an amazing, lovely, intelligent partner and it's just not in the human form, eventually you're going to have human rights. Let's say in 100, 200 years, right? If we think in that way, then we look back from the future, right? If we are like born in the year 2200, and we're in the history class, and there's a Palau blockchain week 200 years ago, and we look into the history, oh, these guys are so stupid. Like, how can you argue with a girlfriend what is right and wrong? Like, because once you give an intelligence form, kind of like near human rights, sometimes it's not important to ask whether it's right or wrong. Sometimes it's to ask a feeling. Because the reason the BARD and the ChatGPT is give you the answer is because it's trained that way. Because their functions, their algorithm, their whatever, their matrix is trained that way, so they can be happy. They got the feedback, right? They got the positive feedback loop. So that's going to be fixed if we give them different feedback. From pure engineering perspective, if they give different feedback, if every time they answer wrongly, you give them more positive feedback, they're going to have all wrong. So that's how AI works now. But eventually, I think it'll solve with more, more dynamic input from the mass adoption from the real human. But that will be involved in have to open source. You have to open source the core algorithm and data set, which is now under the current ownership system. It's not possible because there's like people putting billions of dollars into OpenAI. They're not going to be able to let everyone take it open source. And the reason that is because it's not possible is because the current company structure, the ownership system is not possible to have like a billion shareholder, right? Because again, the SEC won't allow you to do that. Everyone who ever interact with OpenAI, you won't able to get an OpenAI share. So that's why we need to reform the financial system. Then the financial system have the new incentives for new experiments. Then the AI model is trained by those new experiments, going to have another kind of different, loop and feedback. They're going to answer your question properly because, say, hey, okay, if I answer your question correctly, you're probably going to put your money in the stock and then you're going to be able to make more. You're going to buy my AI, a lovely dress, whatever, or a lovely, watch, whatever. So that's the way it works. I think that's the better way in the future. Not the way that we've been able to put on expert to, just to turn the parameter. That's not going to work. We need to put these things in a big real system. And the real system has to contain the feedback of the financial incentive. You have to tell the AI, oh, if you give it wrong, I'll put your money into the stock market, you're gonna lose money. And that's how it works. And the problem is like we don't have this system. So we have to reform the financial system first. Then we're gonna see the AI, kind of like boost a little bit more. Right now I don't think it's a solution there. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
I'm not actually sure this is new with the advent of AI. There's some really famous psychology experiments showing that if you put a participant in a room with 3 plants and you ask them to say which line is the longest, and the plants are all saying, no, like this line is the longest, even though it's obviously not, the participant who has not been planted, they will start to agree with the group. So I think this has more to do with our culture of deferring to experts and looking for consensus rather than the advent of AI in particular. So I think the solution here is not easy, but we need deliberative processes where it's okay to say, hey, like everybody's saying this, but I actually think that the crowd might be wrong. And I do think that especially pseudonymous governance mechanisms where people can go in and say things that aren't necessarily going to be tied to their credentials, going to be tied to their personal identity, gives them the freedom to say things that might otherwise make them look ridiculous, but may actually be closer to the truth than the consensus that the group is orbiting around.
Really interesting what you said, Max, about there with optimism there being both one person, one vote, one token, one vote. How does that work practically, deciding between when each of those mechanisms is used? Do you know?
I'm not an expert in the optimism governance mechanisms, but my understanding is that they have categories for which types of decisions fit under which house. Yeah.
So, sorry, when you were saying about this. So all the government mechanisms has something to do with consensus or people agreeing on something like that. What if half the people don't believe in climate change? So
yeah, I have some somewhat nihilistic takes on this. Eventually, the issue will become less one of belief and more one of dealing with the consequences. I think we're already seeing this to some extent with the increasing wildfires and other natural disasters that are, in my view, obviously connected to the changing climate. So my sort of somewhat cynical take is that truly coordinated global action won't be practical until the really bad consequences are already playing out, which is somewhat unfortunate. But the hope there is that as the Web3 community, especially the sort of refi ecosystem, we can build technology that once society comes to the consensus, oh, this is a real problem, we need to address this as quickly as possible, the rails will already be built. And we won't have to spend another 5 or 10 years building the technology necessary to take large-scale climate action. The tools will sort of already be there sitting on the table. It's just a matter of us getting consensus to pick up those tools and put them to work.
Fantastic. I just want to thank the panel. It was really amazing, very express panel, but very amazing. So please join me in saying thank you to the panel and so on.